On our 10th wedding anniversary, my husband handed me divorce papers across the dinner table our children had helped set with their own small hands. Then, when I asked him why, just asked him why, that's all, he slapped me hard enough that I tasted copper and screamed at me to get out. Take the kids if I wanted, because according to him, none of it had ever truly been mine. I picked up my 6-year-old daughter and my 4-year-old son, one on each hip, walked to the door, turned around, looked him dead in the eye, and said 4 words that I promise you, by the end of the story, will make you want to stand up and cheer. I said, "You need my signature." He laughed at me. I remember that laugh more than I remember the slap. It was short, ugly, disbelieving, the laugh of a man who thought he had already won. He had no idea what those 4 words meant, but he would. Within 6 weeks, he would understand exactly what they meant, and by then it would be far too late for him to do anything about it. My name is Annalise, and this is the story of how the man I built an entire life with tried to erase me from it, and how I made sure that instead he erased himself. 10 years ago, I wasn't the woman who owned half a design and renovation company. I was a 26-year-old with a folding table, a laptop covered in paint splatters, and a stubborn belief that people deserved homes that felt like them instead of a showroom catalog. My father, before he passed, had left me a small commercial building on the edge of town. Nothing glamorous, just 4,000 square feet of drafty warehouse space he'd used for his own contracting business for 30 years. He left it to me specifically, in a trust with very particular language, because he knew me. He knew that if he left it to me outright, someday, some smooth-talking man might convince me to sign it away out of love, or exhaustion, or the simple desire to keep the peace. So he didn't leave it to me outright. He left it to me through a family trust that required my personal, notarized signature for any sale, refinance, or transfer of the property, no matter who else's name got added to anything built on top of it later. My father's lawyer at the time, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Cressida, drew up the paperwork herself and told me something I didn't fully understand until years later. Annalise, love makes people generous. Generosity is beautiful until someone takes advantage of it. This clause isn't about not trusting your future husband. It's about not trusting anyone completely with the one thing your father built with his own hands. I met Ransom 8 months after my father died. He was charming in the specific way that confident men are charming. He complimented the exposed brick in my warehouse before he ever complimented me, and somehow that felt more honest than flattery aimed at my face. He had an MBA and no capital, and I had inherited real estate and no formal business partner. It felt, at the time, like fate. Within a year we were married. Within 2, we had turned my father's dusty warehouse into Solstice Home and Design, a company that renovated houses, staged them, and eventually built a small chain of boutique design showrooms across 3 counties. Ransom handled operations and financing. I handled design, client relationships, and quietly, the trust that owned the physical building everything was built on top of. I want to be honest with you, those first 6 or 7 years were good. Genuinely good. We had Coraline, and 2 years later, Anson. Ransom coached Coraline's soccer team, even though he didn't know a single rule of soccer when he started. I used to fall asleep on the office couch some nights when we were slammed with a launch, and he'd cover me with his jacket and go make the coffee for the morning crew himself. I'm telling you this because I don't want you to think this is a story about a monster who was always a monster. It's a story about a good decade that quietly, slowly curdled, and about how I almost didn't notice until it was nearly too late. The curdling had a name. Her name was Amabel. Amabel came into the business in year 8, introduced to us both as a financial consultant who specialized in helping design and renovation companies scale into franchise models. She was polished in a way that made me feel, for the first time in years, aware of the paint under my fingernails. She spoke to Ransom about growth potential and brand scalability and unlocking equity, phrases that made his eyes light up in a way that our actual clients' happy, tearful reactions to their finished homes never quite did anymore. I noticed the shift before I understood it. Ransom started taking meetings without me. He started saying "we" about decisions I hadn't been part of. He started referring to Solstice as my company in conversations with vendors, dropping the R so casually that I told myself I'd misheard it the first 3 times. I brought it up to him once, gently, over dinner, back when I still believed gentle was the right approach. I asked him if something was different between us. He told me I was being paranoid, that running a business with your spouse naturally creates friction, that I should be grateful he was thinking about the bigger picture while I was still in the weeds with color swatches and client handholding. That word, weeds, sat in my chest for days. I had built the client relationships that made Solstice's reputation. I had quite literally provided the building the entire company operated inside of. But somewhere in those months, in his mind, I had become the smaller partner, the replaceable one. It showed up in small ways first, the kind of small ways I think most women in long marriages will recognize, even if they can't name them right away. He stopped asking me to sit in on vendor calls where I used to be the one closing the deal. He started scheduling strategy dinners with Amabel on nights I'd normally have had the kids do homework at the office so we could all drive home together. He bought a new suit for a pitch meeting, something he'd never done for a client presentation of mine, no matter how large the account. Once, I overheard him on the phone in the garage, laughing at something Amabel said, using a warmer voice than the one he used to ask me how my day had gone. I told myself it was business. I told myself a lot of things that year, because the alternative was admitting that the man I'd built a decade with was quietly rehearsing a version of his life that no longer had a clear role for me in it. What I didn't know then, and wouldn't fully understand until much later, was that Amabel wasn't simply consulting for the business. She was positioning Ransom, carefully, patiently, toward a full buyout and expansion deal with an outside investment group she had relationships with. The deal, as she structured it, would have tripled Solstice's footprint within 18 months. It would have made Ransom, on paper, a wealthy man. There was only one obstacle standing between Ransom and that deal, a decade-old trust document filed with the county that meant nothing could be sold, refinanced, or transferred without my notarized signature because the physical building the entire business sat on still legally belonged to a trust with my name as sole beneficiary and sole authorized signer. Ransom had forgotten about that clause. Or maybe he'd never fully understood it in the first place. Men who don't build the foundation rarely bother reading the fine print of the foundation. Amabel, being thorough, had not forgotten. She had, in fact, spent several months trying to find a workaround. And when she couldn't find one, she landed on something simpler and crueler instead: get rid of the wife. The plan, as it was eventually explained to me by Cressida months later, reading it off a printed timeline like a woman diagnosing a wound, was almost insultingly straightforward. If Ransom divorced me quickly, quietly, and on terms unfavorable to me, terms I might sign in shock and grief, in a hurry to protect my children from watching their parents fight, there was a chance, a real legal chance, that a rushed settlement could include language transferring all business-adjacent property interests to him. Not the trust itself, which couldn't legally be touched that way, but enough vague language, signed by an overwhelmed, blindsided woman without her own lawyer in the room, to create real leverage Amabel could then use to argue, in front of investors, that the ownership question was resolved and the deal could proceed. It very nearly worked. It nearly worked because grief and humiliation make people move fast and think slow, and Ransom knew that about me. He knew that if he did it publicly enough, painfully enough, I would want to run rather than fight. He chose our 10th anniversary because he knew I'd planned something. I'd booked our favorite Italian place for the following weekend and asked Coraline and Anson to help me set our own dining room table that night instead. Cloth napkins folded into little triangles by 4-year-old hands, a store-bought cake with both kids' names signed on it in blue icing because Anson had insisted his name go on too, even though it wasn't his anniversary. I wanted one quiet, real family dinner before the fancier one. I wanted Ransom to see, in our own kitchen, everything he still had. Instead, he waited until the kids were seated, waited until I'd lit the candle in the center of the table, and then set an envelope down next to my plate. "I think it's time we stop pretending," he said, in the same voice he used for closing vendor negotiations. I opened it in front of my children because I genuinely thought it might be a card. It was not a card. It was a petition for dissolution of marriage, already signed by him, already dated, with a sticky note on top in his handwriting that said, simply, sign where marked. Coraline asked what it was. I told her it was grown-up paperwork, my voice doing something I didn't know voices could do, staying level while everything underneath it collapsed. I asked Ransom, quietly, if we could talk about this somewhere else, somewhere without our children at the table. That's when he stood up so fast his chair hit the floor and told me I'd had 10 years to figure out my place, and that my place had apparently never included understanding whose name was actually on things. When I said his name wasn't on the building, which was true, and which I said only because I was frightened and reaching for the one fact I knew was solid ground, something in his face changed in a way I'd never seen before. He crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and slapped me across the face hard enough to spin my head sideways, hard enough that Anson started screaming before I even registered the sting. Get out, he said. Take the kids if you want them. Get out of my house. I want you to understand something about that sentence, because it's the sentence this entire story turns on. He believed it completely. He believed the house, the business, the decade, all of it, had only ever existed because of him, and that I was, and always had been, a guest in my own life. He wasn't claiming the children as his alone. Not even in that moment of rage did he go that far, but he wanted me to feel like I was leaving with nothing else, and for one long, cold second in that kitchen I did. I picked up Anson, who wouldn't stop crying, and took Coraline's small, shaking hand, and I walked to the door. And then I turned around because some part of me, maybe my father's part, the part that had insisted on that trust language a decade earlier when I thought it was excessive and unnecessary, knew exactly what to say. You need my signature. 4 words. I didn't explain them. I didn't need to, not yet. I just watched his face flicker with confusion instead of triumph, and I walked my children out into the cold. We spent that first night at my sister-in-law's place. Ransom's own sister, Autoline, who opened her door at 11 at night without a single question when she saw my face and my children's tear-streaked cheeks. I want to mention Autoline here because she matters later. She took one look at the mark on my cheek, said nothing judgmental about her brother in front of the kids, put both children to bed in her guest room with the nightlight on, and then sat across from me at her kitchen table and said, "Tell me everything. All of it. And then tell me what you need." 3 days later, when the bruise had bloomed into its full, ugly color instead of fading, I went to an urgent care clinic near Adeline's house, not because I needed medical treatment, but because I needed a dated, time-stamped medical record. The nurse practitioner photographed it, documented the location and shape of the mark, and asked me, gently and without pressure, whether I felt safe going home. I told her I didn't have a home to go back to. She gave me a folder of resources anyway, along with a printed visit summary, which I kept in a manila envelope in my glove box for the next several weeks like it was the most valuable document I owned. It was Autoline, actually, who suggested I call Cressida, my late father's old attorney, the one who had drafted the original trust. I'd stayed in touch with Cressida over the years myself, mostly for routine trust paperwork and an annual check in her office required, so it wasn't strange that Autoline knew her name too. Cressida had also handled some of the family's estate matters after my father passed, matters that touched Ransom's side of the family a little as well. It was a small, unglamorous overlap, the kind that happens in real families with a long-time small-town lawyer, not a movie twist. I called Cressida the next morning. I still remember sitting in her office, wrapped in Adeline's borrowed coat because I hadn't packed for winter when I fled my own kitchen, telling her everything. The papers, the slap, the 4 words I'd said without fully understanding why. Cressida listened without interrupting, the way she always had, and when I finished, she pulled a thick file from a cabinet behind her. My father's file, the original 1998 trust documents, still crisp despite their age. "Annalise," she said, "your father was not a sentimental man, God rest him, but he was a careful one. He put language in this trust that I have used exactly twice in my entire career. Do you understand what it means that Ransom put your name on a divorce petition that references business assets built on top of this property? I told her I didn't, not fully. It means, she said, that any refinancing, expansion, sale, or transfer involving Solstice's physical footprint requires your notarized signature as sole trustee beneficiary. Not a joint signature, not a majority vote among partners. Yours, alone. If your husband has been discussing an outside investment or buyout with anyone, and I suspect, from what you're telling me, that he has, that deal cannot legally close. Not without you. And it never could have. Not for one single day of your marriage. I sat in that office and felt something shift in my chest that I can only describe as the exact opposite of a slap. Not triumph yet. Just the first, cold clarity of understanding that I was not, in fact, standing on nothing. The following weeks were not cinematic. I want to be honest about that too, because I think stories like mine sometimes get told as if the moment you learn the truth, everything resolves in a satisfying montage. It didn't. I was still a woman with 2 young children, a mark fading slowly on my cheek, and a business I had built with my own hands that I could not currently set foot inside of because Ransom had changed the locks on the Solstice offices, not the trust building itself, which he legally couldn't touch, but the interior offices where our client files, my design portfolio, and 10 years of work lived. Coraline started asking, every night at bedtime when we were going home. Anson, too young to ask questions like that, simply started sleeping with his shoes on, which broke something in me every single night I found them still laced on his small feet. I want any parent watching this to know the hardest part of a betrayal like this is never the paperwork. It's watching your children absorb an earthquake they didn't cause and can't understand, and having to be steady for them while your own foundation is being actively dismantled. I picked up part-time freelance design consulting in those weeks, just to keep some money moving, sketching kitchen layouts for strangers at Adeline's kitchen table after the kids were asleep, my laptop propped against a stack of Anson's picture books, because Adeline's outlet was on the wrong side of the room for a proper desk. I remember one night falling asleep mid-sentence in an email to a client and waking up at 4 a.m. with a crick in my neck and Coraline's stuffed rabbit somehow tucked under my arm, though I never remembered her bringing it to me. Adeline found me there in the morning and didn't say anything about it. She just made coffee for 2 and set mine down without a word, the same way Ransom used to, except this time it didn't feel like a performance of kindness. It felt like someone actually seeing me. There was a Tuesday, about 3 weeks in, when Coraline's teacher called to tell me she'd cried quietly at her desk during story time and wouldn't say why. I left a client walkthrough half-finished to go sit in the school parking lot with my daughter in my lap for 20 minutes before she'd tell me she was scared Daddy didn't love her anymore because he yelled that night. I told her the truth, in words small enough for a 6-year-old to hold, that grown-ups sometimes make choices that have nothing to do with how much they love their children, and that nothing she did, and nothing I did, caused what happened in that kitchen. I don't know if she fully believed me that day. I know she believes it now. Cressida moved fast. Within a week, she filed a countersuit that included a documented incident of domestic violence, supported by the urgent care records, timestamp photographs, and a written statement from Autoline confirming the state I'd arrived in that night, along with an emergency motion regarding the children's temporary custody and residence. A judge, reviewing the file, granted me temporary primary physical custody within days, along with a temporary restraining order requiring Ransom to maintain distance from me and communicate only through counsel. He was notably not thrilled about that last part, because it meant he could no longer simply show up wherever I was and talk his way through a room the way he talked his way through every negotiation of our marriage. Meanwhile, word of the temporary restraining order reached Amabel's investment group faster than Ransom could control the narrative around it. I learned later, through documents that surfaced in discovery, that the investment group had a standard morality and reputational risk clause in their term sheet, unsurprising, given how these deals work, and that a documented domestic violence filing against the company's majority operator was exactly the kind of headline risk that made cautious money get colder. Amabel, to her credit or her ruthlessness, depending on how you want to see it, did not slow down out of loyalty. She started, instead, quietly restructuring the deal to route around ransom entirely, approaching Cressida's office directly to ask, with breathtaking nerve, whether I might be interested in selling my trust interest outright to clear the path for a deal that no longer needed him as the face of it. That was the moment I understood something important. Amabel had never actually been loyal to Ransom. She had been loyal to the deal. He was a means to an end for her the exact same way. In his mind, I had become one for him. He just hadn't realized yet that he'd been demoted to obstacle, same as me. I said no to Amabel, obviously. Cressida delivered that no herself, in writing, with a level of professional coldness that I found deeply satisfying to read even secondhand. Amabel didn't accept that no quietly, though. She called my cell phone directly 2 days later. I never learned how she got the number, and I've chosen not to spend energy wondering. And her voice was pleasant in the specific way people are pleasant right before they say something designed to hurt you. She told me she understood this must all feel very personal to me, but that I should really consider whether holding on to sentimental real estate was worth the cost of watching a growing company stall out because of what she called one signature and a lot of feelings. She said Ransom had told her I was the type of person who liked to feel needed, and that maybe, if I sold my interest quietly, I could feel needed one more time by doing the mature thing. I sat in my car outside Coraline's school with the phone against my ear and felt something in me go very still and very cold, the exact opposite of the shaking I'd felt the night of the slap. I told her, as evenly as I could manage, that my father built that building with his own hands before either she or Ransom ever set foot in it, that my signature wasn't sentimental, it was legal, and that she could tell Ransom I said the deal he was chasing had been dead the moment he decided a decade of my life was disposable. Then I hung up before she could answer, because I didn't need the last word anymore. I just needed her to know she wasn't going to get one either. That phone call, more than the slap, more than the papers on the table, was the moment I stopped grieving my marriage and started preparing for what came next. Grief makes you small. Anger, the right kind, the kind that isn't wasted on people who don't deserve your energy, makes you exact. But saying no wasn't the revenge. The revenge, if you want to call it that, though I've come to think of it less as revenge and more as simply refusing to disappear, came about 6 weeks after that anniversary dinner in a conference room I insisted on attending myself. Ransom's attorney had requested a settlement meeting, clearly hoping to negotiate down the domestic violence filing and salvage some version of the original plan, perhaps some partial interest in Solstice's operating entity, if not the building itself. I sat across the table from my husband of 10 years for the first time since the slap. He looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. Amabel was not in the room. I noticed that immediately, and I think Ransom noticed me noticing. Cressida laid out our position clearly. The trust remained untouched and untouchable. The temporary custody arrangement would very likely become permanent, given the documented incident. And this was the part I'd asked her to say for last, the part one wanted to say myself. Solstice Home and Design's operating agreement, the one Ransom had drafted years earlier during a period when he was, in his own words, handling the business side so I could focus on the creative side, listed me as a 50% equity holder with a specific clause requiring unanimous partner consent for any change in business structure, sale, or outside investment. Ransom had written that clause himself years ago, back when he'd wanted to reassure himself, really, that neither of us could ever push the other out unilaterally. He'd meant it as a romantic gesture at the time, one partner protecting the other. He had simply never imagined a version of the future where he'd be the one trying to invoke it against me, only to discover it worked exactly as well in reverse. "You need my signature for the trust," I told him, finally, across that conference table, in the same 4 words I'd said in my kitchen doorway 6 weeks earlier, except this time I finished the sentence. "You needed my signature for the operating agreement, too. You've needed it this entire time, Ransom. You just never thought you would." I watched something in him finally break, not with anger this time, but with the particular, quiet devastation of a man realizing the walls he thought he built around himself were actually walls he built around me, all along, without knowing it. Here's what happened in the months after, laid out plainly, because I think the plain facts matter more than any dramatic flourish I could add to them. During final due diligence, counsel for the investors confirmed the trust restrictions and the unanimous consent clause directly with Cressida's office, exactly as thorough investors are supposed to before a closing. The investment deal collapsed entirely once it became clear neither the trust nor the operating agreement could be maneuvered around. Amabel's investment group withdrew, citing unresolved ownership complications, which is corporate language for exactly what it sounds like. Amabel herself, I heard through mutual acquaintances, moved on to another firm within the year, her interest in Ransom apparently exactly as durable as his usefulness to her had been. The domestic violence filing, supported by the urgent care documentation and Adeline's statement, resulted in a long-term protective order covering me personally as part of our final divorce decree, while parenting exchanges with Ransom were handled through structured arrangements, not eliminated entirely, because Cressida was clear with me that courts favor maintaining a parent relationship where safety can be reasonably managed through structure, but restricted in a way that finally, formally, put on record what had happened in my kitchen that night. I was granted primary physical custody. The Solstice operating agreement was restructured through mediation, and because Ransom had, in his own rushed attempt to force me out, breached the very unanimous consent clause he'd written by continuing deal discussions with Amabel's group without my knowledge or consent, I ended up, through legal settlement, with controlling interest in the company I had built the client relationships and design reputation for in the first place. Ransom kept a minority stake and an operations consulting role, reporting into a management structure where I now held controlling authority for the first time in a decade. I did not gloat about that. I want to be honest about that too. I didn't call him to rub it in. I simply signed the paperwork, in Cressida's office, at the same desk where I'd first learned what my father's foresight had actually protected, and felt, for the first time in months, like I could breathe all the way down into my chest. Adeline still comes to Coraline's soccer games, by the way. She and I are closer now than she and her own brother are, which neither of us planned and both of us are quietly grateful for. She tells me sometimes that watching what happened changed how she talks to her own daughter about money and paperwork, and never assuming a marriage protects you the way people promise it will. I don't think she means it as a warning against love. I think she means it the way I've come to understand it myself, that loving someone fully and protecting yourself fully were never supposed to be opposites, no matter how many people insist otherwise. Anson doesn't sleep in his shoes anymore. He asked me last month, out of nowhere, while I was tucking him in, whether Daddy was going to come to his birthday party this year. I told him yes, on the days and times the court had arranged, and that his father loved him even though grown-up things had changed between the two of us. He accepted that answer the way 4-year-olds accept most things, completely, and then immediately asked if there would be cake. Coraline asked me, a few months ago, what would have happened if I hadn't said those 4 words that night in the doorway. I told her the truth. I said them because some instinct in me, something my own father had built into my life a decade before either of us existed, whispered that I was standing on more solid ground than anyone in that kitchen believed. She thought about that for a long moment and then asked if Grandpa had known, somehow, that this would happen. I run Solstice full-time now, from the same warehouse office with the exposed brick Ransom once complimented before he ever complimented me. The client roster has grown. The design portfolio is entirely under my name for the first time since I let someone else's name get printed alongside it. Some mornings I still catch myself flinching slightly when I hear a chair scrape hard against a floor, an old reflex from a kitchen I don't live in anymore. It fades a little more each year. I don't think he knew. I think he simply understood something about love and ownership that I didn't fully understand myself until the night I needed it most. That protecting the people you love sometimes means protecting them from the exact people they'll one day love back. If you were in that kitchen that night, watching a decade of your life get handed to you in an envelope, would you have run, or would you have turned around and said 4 words of your own? If you enjoyed the story, don't forget to like, subscribe to Valira Payback, and share your thoughts in the comments.